The three men had Benjamin Dalton on his knees in the frost-hard mud before he even saw the axe come out of the tree line. "You've got a fortnight's worth of the Lord's venison strung up in that shed," the tallest one said, boot pressed against Benjamin's shoulder, "and Lord Ashcombe pays good coin for men who catch poachers red-handed, even when that poacher is his own gamekeeper." Benjamin did not deny it. He could not. The smoked haunches hanging in his shed were meant for the widow Harlow's 6 children and old Tam Fenwick, whose leg had never healed right since the war, and for every soul in the crumbling settlement at Kestrel's Reach who would not otherwise eat before spring. He had signed his name to guard Lord Ashcombe's forest from thieves, but he had never signed away his conscience, and there was a difference between a poacher who fed himself and a gamekeeper who fed a dying outpost the Lord had forgotten existed. "Take it up with his lordship, then," Benjamin said through his teeth, "instead of putting your boot on a man who's done nothing but keep folks from starving." The second man, a broad brute with a scar cutting through one eyebrow, backhanded him across the jaw hard enough that Benjamin tasted copper. He was reaching for the rope coiled at his belt, the kind men used to drag accused thieves back to the Lord's keep at the end of a horse, when a voice like a landslide rolled out of the pines behind them. He said, "Take it up with the Lord." All three men turned, and Benjamin, blood on his lip, turned with them, and what he saw stole the breath clean out of his lungs. She stood at the tree line with the low winter sun behind her, tall enough to look the tallest man near level in the eye even from a distance, her green-gray skin catching the light like river stone, black hair bound back in a thick braid that fell past her shoulder. She wore fitted travel leathers, dark and worn soft with wear, laced snug up her sides and across a chest that strained the laces, a wide belt cinched at her waist, and over one shoulder she carried a woodcutter's axe nearly as long as Benjamin's own leg, its head scarred from old battles, its haft polished by years of a single hand's grip. Her eyes, when they found Benjamin kneeling in the mud, were a deep amber, and they did not look at him like he was pitiable. They looked at him like he was hers to decide something about. "This is Lord's business, Orc," the tall man said, though his voice had lost some of its iron. "Walk on." "I answered an advertisement," she said, and reached into her belt, drawing out a scrap of parchment gone soft at the folds, posted at the trading post at Kestrel's Reach. "Hired hand wanted, wages fair, room provided, applied to Benjamin Dalton, gamekeeper." She let the parchment fall to the mud, unneeded now that she had said it aloud. "I am applying." The scarred man laughed, short and ugly. "Apply somewhere else. We've business with this one." "You have your boot on my future employer," she said, and there was something almost pleasant in her voice, the way a butcher might sound pleasant discussing which blade to use. "Take it off." The tall man's hand went to his sword hilt, and that was the last mistake he made before she moved. Benjamin had seen soldiers drill, had seen men brawl in taverns and lords' men practice at the ring, and he had never seen anything move the way Ragesh Fireblood moved, closing the distance in 3 strides, the axe coming off her shoulder in a single fluid arc that was not aimed to kill. He understood later, only to terrify, the flat of the blade cracking across the tall man's forearm hard enough to spin him off his feet with a scream. The haft driving into the scarred man's gut and folding him over gasping into the mud. The third man ran before she'd finished with the second, disappearing into the trees at a dead sprint, and the scarred man crawled after him on his hands and knees, wheezing, leaving the tall one curled around his ruined arm in the frost. "Get him," she said to the sky, not looking at the fleeing man, "before I get him." The tall man dragged himself upright and limped away without his sword, which lay forgotten in the mud. Ragesh Fireblood set the head of her axe down in the dirt, leaned on the haft and looked down at Benjamin Dalton, still kneeling, still bleeding from the lip, staring up at her like she was something out of a story told to frighten children that had somehow walked into daylight and turned out beautiful instead of terrible. "You are Benjamin Dalton," she said. "I am," he managed. "You are the one hiring." "I am." "Good." She reached down one broad hand, and without asking, hauled him up out of the mud like he weighed nothing at all, setting him on his feet in front of her so that he had to tip his head back to meet her eyes. "Then we have terms to discuss, and you are bleeding on your shirt." He touched his split lip, found it true, and laughed despite himself, a startled, disbelieving laugh that came from somewhere he hadn't used in a long while. "Ma'am, I don't know what wage you're expecting, but I don't know that I can afford whatever you're worth." "Ragesh Fireblood," she said by way of answer, and held out her hand, the one not resting on her axe, and he took it, and her grip swallowed his whole. "You will find I am cheap. I ask for a roof, a wage, and no man's hand on me without my say. In return you get an axe that never dulls and a widow who has buried one husband and does not fear burying trouble." "A widow," Benjamin said before he could stop himself, and something in his chest, some old ache he'd stopped naming, tightened at the word. "3 winters gone," she said simply. "Clan business. It does not matter here. What matters is whether you still want a hired hand, gamekeeper, or whether you'd rather kneel in mud for men who serve a lord that has never once ridden out to see the ruin he owns." Benjamin looked past her, down the frost-cracked road toward Kestrel's Reach, the broken watchtower leaning against the winter sky, the half-collapsed curtain wall of the old fort that a dozen desperate families now called home, because there was nowhere else left for them to go. He looked back at her, at the axe resting easy in her hand like it was an extension of her arm, at the amber eyes that had not once flinched from him. "I want the hired hand," he said. "God help me, I do." Kestrel's Reach had not always been a ruin. 60 years past it had been a border fort, garrisoned against orc raids down out of the northern passes, its stones cut and stacked by men who believed the frontier would always need watching. The wars had ended before Benjamin was born, a fragile peace signed and mostly kept, and the fort had been abandoned to weather and time, until families with nowhere else to go started drifting back to its broken walls, because a roof half fallen was still more roof than none. Lord Ashcombe claimed the land, claimed the forest around it, claimed the game that ran through it, and sent Benjamin Dalton out to guard all 3. But he had never once sent food, or masons, or coin, though he took his share of furs and venison every autumn as if the Reach were a farm instead of a graveyard of stone. Benjamin had grown up in a cottage 2 valleys over, the only child of a woodsman father who'd died under a felled oak and a mother who'd followed him into the ground from grief within the year. And by 17, he had learned that the world did not owe lonely men anything, least of all comfort. He had taken the gamekeeper's post because it paid, and he had stayed at Kestrel's Reach because somewhere in tending its broken families, he had found a kind of purpose he had never had tending only himself. He had put up the notice for a hired hand because winter was coming hard and the wall around the fort's granary needed more hands than his to hold against wolves and worse, and because, if he was honest with the cold nights, he had grown so long alone that even the thought of another voice in the gamekeeper's cottage felt like warmth. He had not expected an orc widow with amber eyes and an axe of her own. He led her back along the frozen road, the fort's broken tower rising ahead of them against a sky the color of a bruise, smoke curling from chimneys patched with mud and stolen stone. She walked beside him without hurry, unbothered by the cold, her breath coming in slow white clouds, and he found himself stealing glances at her sideways, the strong line of her jaw, the way her braids swung when she turned her head, and each time he caught himself doing it he looked hard at the road instead, ashamed of how quickly his eyes had gone to her and how little shame he actually felt. "You are staring, gamekeeper," she said without looking at him. "Apologies," he said. "Don't get many orcs answering ads for hired hands out this way." "You do not get many orcs anywhere out this way," she said. "There is a war behind us, even if the swords are put down. Your people remember it. Mine remember it worse." She glanced at him then, and there was something testing in the look, something that wanted to see if he would flinch the way the men in the mud had flinched, the way strangers so often did. "Does that trouble you?" "No," he said, and meant it plainly enough that even he was a little surprised by how easy the truth came. What troubles me is 3 men had their boot on my throat an hour past, and you're the one who put a stop to it, and I've yet to properly thank you." "You hired me," she said. "That is thanks enough for now. I haven't paid you a single coin. You will." She said it not as a threat but as a simple fact of the world, the way a person might say the sun would rise. "I do not work for men who cannot pay. I worked for one once who could not, and it cost me dear. I do not make that mistake twice." There was a weight behind the words that he did not press on, sensing the shape of grief even where he could not yet see its edges, and they walked the rest of the way to the fort in a silence that did not feel unkind. The gate of Kestrel's Reach was 2 half-rotted timbers propped against a gap in the wall, and old Tam Fenwick was posted there on his bad leg with a spear he could barely lift, and when he saw Ragesh Fireblood come walking up the road beside the gamekeeper, his jaw dropped clean open. "Ben," he said, "there's an orc walking up to our gate." "There is," Benjamin agreed. "She's answering my ad. Your ad for a hired hand. That's the one." Tam looked at Ragesh, at the axe on her shoulder, at the easy, unbothered set of her posture, the way she looked back at him without malice but also without any softening, simply taking his measure the way she seemed to take everyone's measure, and after a long moment he stepped aside from the gate. "Well," he said, "God knows we could use the hands. You'll want to mind the widow Harlow's tongue, though. She's not fond of orcs. Lost her husband in the border wars." "I am an orc widow," Ragesh said, "who lost a husband to different wars. I do not need her fondness. I need work." That evening, the fort's handful of families gathered in the old commons yard, once a drilling ground for soldiers, now packed dirt ringed by lean-tos and patched cottages built into the bones of the old barracks, to see the stranger the gamekeeper had brought home. The widow Harlow stood with her 6 children pressed close around her skirts, her face pinched hard as a winter apple, and when Ragesh Fireblood walked into the firelight her hand went white-knuckled on the eldest boy's shoulder. "You'd bring one of them here," she said to Benjamin, not troubling to lower her voice, "among the children." "I'd bring a hired hand here," Benjamin said, "same as I'd have brought any other, and this hand already put 3 of the Lord's bully men in the mud today for putting hands on me. I think you'd want that sort of help before winter closes the passes." "I do not fear children," Ragesh said, before the widow Harlow could answer, and crouched, slow and deliberate, until she was near level with the boy peering out from behind his mother's skirts, a lad of maybe 8 with wide, frightened eyes. "I had a nephew your age once. He liked to throw stones at my shins to see if he could make me flinch." She held out one broad palm, offering nothing, asking nothing, simply open. "You may throw a stone at mine if you like. I promise I will not flinch, and neither will you need to fear me after." The boy looked up at his mother, then, tentative, reached out and set one small hand in the orc woman's palm instead of throwing anything, and Ragesh closed her fingers gentle as breath around his, and did not let go until he pulled away laughing at the tickle of her calloused skin. The widow Harlow did not soften, not that first night, her mouth staying a thin hard line, but she did not order the boy back either, and Benjamin, watching from the edge of the firelight, felt something in his chest turn over slow and warm, watching this woman who had cracked a grown man's arm in the road that very afternoon kneel gentle in the dirt for a frightened child. She stayed the winter's first snowfall in the loft above the granary, insisting she needed no better, though Benjamin argued she ought to take the second room in his own cottage rather than freeze above the grain. And she told him with a flat, amused look that she had slept in worse than a dry loft, and did not need coddling from a man half her weight in muscle. He laughed at that, surprised into it, and she smiled then for the first time he'd seen, a real smile, sharp-toothed and warm, and he thought privately that he would happily freeze 20 winters just to see it again. Work at the fort found its rhythm quickly enough. Ragesh Fireblood turned out to have a mason's eye alongside a warrior's arm, and within a week she had the granary wall shored with fresh-cut stone hauled up from the old riverbed, working alongside Benjamin from gray dawn until the light failed, the 2 of them falling into an easy partnership neither had expected. She swung a hammer the way other women might swing a fan, effortless. And more than once Benjamin caught himself standing idle just to watch the play of muscle across her shoulders as she worked, the sheen of sweat at her collarbone despite the cold. And each time she caught him looking, she did not scold him for it, only held his gaze a beat too long before returning to her work, a small private curl at the corner of her mouth that told him plainly enough she did not mind being watched by him at all. "You stare like a man who has forgotten how," she told him one evening, hauling the last stone of the day into place with a grunt of effort while he held the lantern. "Forgotten how to stare. Forgotten how to want something and let himself be seen wanting it." She dusted her hands off against her thighs, leather creaking, and looked at him sidelong. "You have been alone a long time, Benjamin Dalton." "Since my folks passed," he admitted. "Never seemed much point courting when there was nothing here worth staying for. Everyone I loved left me one way or another. Figured it was easier not to love much at all. And now." He did not answer right away, and she did not press him, only watched him in the lantern light with those amber eyes until he found the courage to say, "Now I think maybe I forgot the wanting for lack of something worth wanting." Something shifted in her face then, some careful wall coming down a fraction, and she stepped closer to him in the cold dark, close enough that he could feel the warmth coming off her despite the frost, close enough that his heart went a hammering in a way that had nothing to do with cold at all. "I buried a husband who I loved with everything a warrior has to give," she said quietly, "and I swore I would not be fool enough to give that much again. But you are a strange man, Benjamin Dalton. You kneel in mud for strangers, and you do not flinch from an orc's axe, and you look at me like I am something worth looking at instead of something to fear or something to pity." Her hand came up slow and rested against his jaw where the bruise from the tall man's fist had gone yellow-green, her thumb brushing gentle over the healing skin. "I did not come here for this." "What did you come here for?" he asked, his voice gone rough. "Wages," she said, "and a roof, and a place a widow with an axe could be useful instead of pitied." Her thumb kept its slow path along his jaw. "I did not plan on wanting the man who hired me. I didn't plan on wanting the woman who saved my life in the road," he said, "but here we are." She kissed him then, or he kissed her. Neither of them ever quite settled the question after, only that the lantern nearly went over from how quickly his hand found her waist and her hand found the back of his neck. And the kiss was not gentle, not tentative, but hungry in the way of two people who had each spent years convincing themselves they did not need what they were now discovering they had wanted all along. When they broke apart, both breathing hard in the frozen dark, she rested her forehead against his and laughed low in her chest. "Well," she said, "that settles the question of wages at least. You owe me considerably more than coin now." "I'll pay whatever you ask," he said, and meant it in every way a man could mean such a thing. Word of the orc woman working at Kestrel's Reach traveled faster than either of them liked. 3 weeks after her arrival, a cart came up the frozen road from the market town of Belhaven, bearing 2 merchants and a small crowd of the curious and the hostile trailing behind on foot, drawn by rumor of an orc widow living openly among the fort's families. Benjamin stood in the gate when they arrived, Ragesh a half step behind him, her axe resting easy against her shoulder, and the leader of the crowd, a broad merchant named Corbin Wick who ran the grain trade through Belhaven, looked at her the way a man looks at a wolf that has wandered too near the sheep pen. "There's talk in Belhaven," Wick said, "that you've taken an orc into your fort, gamekeeper. Taken her into more than that if half the talk is true." "There's talk in Belhaven about a great many things," Benjamin said evenly. "Doesn't make it Belhaven's business. It's our business when she's living a half-day's ride from our own women and children." A woman in the crowd called out, and others took up the muttering behind her, ugly and low, the kind of noise Benjamin had heard before in his life, aimed at other people, and never once thought he would stand in the middle of aimed at someone he loved. "I have not raised a hand against anyone in this fort who did not raise one first against me or mine," Ragesh said, stepping forward, her voice carrying easy over the crowd's noise, and there was no fear in it, only a warrior's flat patience. I have mended walls. I have hauled stone. I have sat with your widow Harlow's children by the fire and taught them knots for hauling water, and not one of them has come to harm by my hand. If you have come to see a monster, you have wasted a cold ride. Orcs burned my father's farm, a young man near the front spat. I don't care how many stones you haul. Then I am sorry for your father, Ragesh said, and something in the plainness of it, the lack of any defensiveness, seemed to catch the young man off guard. War makes monsters of us all, on every side of it. I lost my husband to a raid your people call justice and mine call slaughter. We do not have to agree on the wars behind us to share the road ahead of us. I am not asking your love. I am asking to be let alone to earn my keep. Corbin Wick studied her a long moment, then looked to Benjamin. And you, gamekeeper, you'd stand behind an orc against your own kind. I'd stand behind anyone who's done right by the people in this fort, Benjamin said, and she's done more right by them in 3 weeks than Lord Ashcombe's done in 3 years. If you've come to run her off, you'll have to go through me first, and I'd rather you didn't because I've grown fond of my own teeth. A ripple of unwilling laughter moved through part of the crowd at that, breaking some of the tension, and Wick, who was a merchant before he was anything else and had no taste for a fight that would cost him custom either way, finally shrugged and turned his cart around, muttering that Belhaven would remember the gamekeeper's choice come trading season. The crowd dispersed slowly, still muttering, but no blows were thrown, and Benjamin, watching them go, felt Ragesh's hand find his own where it hung at his side, her fingers lacing through his in front of anyone left to see, a small, fierce claiming that made his throat go tight. You did not have to say that, she said quietly once the road was empty again, about standing behind me. I meant every word, he said, wasn't going to say anything less. Most men would have. I'm not most men. No, she agreed, and there was something in her voice, low and warm, that told him she had decided that a long while before he'd said a word to Wick's crowd at all. You are not. Winter came down on Kestrel's reach like a fist closing. The first heavy snow fell in the second week after Wick's crowd had come and gone, and it did not stop for 3 days, burying the road to Belhaven under drifts higher than a man's waist, sealing the fort off from the world beyond its broken walls as surely as any siege. Benjamin had seen hard winters before, but nothing like the one that settled over the reach that year, the wind screaming through the gaps in the old curtain wall, the temperature dropping so far that water froze solid in the buckets within an hour of drawing it. The game Benjamin was meant to guard for the Lord vanishing deep into whatever shelter it could find, leaving nothing for the fort's hunters to bring home. The families held together as best they could, sharing what stores remained, but by the 3rd week of true winter the granary Ragesh had spent her first month reinforcing was running dangerously thin, and the widow Harlow's youngest had taken a fever that would not break, and old Tam Fenwick's bad leg had gone black at the edges from cold. He could not keep from it no matter how close to the fire he sat. Benjamin and Ragesh took to hunting together in the brief gray hours of daylight, ranging out from the fort's walls into forest gone silent and white, and it was there, in the deep hush of a snowbound wood, that Benjamin came to know a different side of her than the axe-swinging warrior who had cracked a man's arm on the road. You move quiet for someone your size, he told her once, watching her cross a frozen creek bed without a sound, her breath fogging pale in the freezing air. My people hunted these mountains before your people built walls to keep us out of them, she said, not unkindly, only stating a fact worn smooth by years. I learned to move quiet before I learned to walk upright, or so my mother told it. Tell me about her, your mother. Ragesh was quiet a moment, crouching to check a snare Benjamin had set the day before empty, the wire gone stiff with frost. She died before the wars ended. Fever, not blade. My father raised me and my brothers after, taught us the axe because he said a daughter without a weapon in these mountains was a daughter buried early. She straightened, looking off into the white trees. He was not wrong to fear it. My husband died with a blade in his hand, defending a hunting party from raiders who did not care that the peace was signed. I was 3 valleys away when it happened. I did not even get to say farewell. I'm sorry, Benjamin said, and meant it with his whole chest. It was a long time ago. She looked at him then, something soft breaking through the old grief in her eyes. I did not think I would want to speak of him to anyone again. I did not think I would want much of anything again, if I am honest. And then a man knelt in the mud in front of 3 bullies and refused to bend his conscience for a lord who never earned his loyalty, and I thought, there is a man worth wanting something for again. He crossed the frozen creek to stand in front of her, close enough that their breath mingled in the cold, and cupped her face in his gloved hands, and she let him, tipping her forehead down to rest against his on the way she had that first night by the granary wall. I'll never leave you standing in a field wondering where I've gone, he told her, low and fierce. Whatever else happens to us, I swear that to you. Careful what you swear, gamekeeper, she murmured, though her voice had gone thick. My people hold an oath heavier than yours might. There is no unswearing it once given. Good, he said. I don't want to unswear it, not ever. She kissed him then in the hush of the snowbound wood, slow this time instead of hungry, deep and searching, and when they finally drew apart she looked at him with something like wonder, like a woman discovering a warmth she had long ago given up expecting to feel again, and neither one of them spoke of leaving each other again after that. Not once, not for the rest of the winter. But the wood that had given them that quiet moment together did not stay gentle. 3 days later, ranging further from the fort than they had before in search of game that had not vanished entirely, they came across a trapper's line strung with snares far too well made and far too numerous to belong to any of the fort's own hunters. And following it back through the trees, they found the camp of 5 men Benjamin recognized with a lurch of his stomach as Lord Ashcombe's own foresters. The men whose duty it was to enforce the very laws Benjamin himself had been quietly breaking all autumn to feed the reach. Dalton, the lead forester said, a hard-faced man named Croft that Benjamin had crossed paths with twice before over the years and liked less each time. Didn't expect to find you out this far, nor your companion. His eyes slid over Ragesh with open distaste. His lordship's heard talk you've taken an orc onto the Reach's grounds. Heard other talk, too, about venison going missing from lands you're paid to guard. I guard what needs guarding, Benjamin said carefully, and I hire who I please. Neither's your business, Croft. It's his lordship's business, and that makes it mine. Croft nodded to the men flanking him, 4 rough sorts with crossbows slung ready, the kind of men lords hired when they wanted enforcement without conscience attached. His lordship wants you brought in for questioning over the missing stock. And he wants that orc off his land before nightfall, or she answers to worse than questioning. She's done no harm to a soul out here, Benjamin said, feeling the old fury from the road rise up in him again, sharper now because it was Ragesh they threatened instead of only himself. She's kept families alive through a winter his lordship's never once ridden out to see. His lordship doesn't pay you to keep families alive, Croft said. He pays you to keep his forest and his game, and you've failed at both if the talk's true. Come quiet, Dalton, and maybe he goes easy on you. Fight, and we'll take you in rougher than you'd like. It was Ragesh who moved first, stepping half in front of Benjamin with her axe already off her shoulder, and Croft's men raised their crossbows in answer, the click of drawn strings sudden and loud in the winter hush. Lower them, Benjamin said, moving to put himself between the raised crossbows and Ragesh in turn, before someone does something that can't be undone. Get out of the way, gamekeeper, Croft said. This isn't your fight to bleed for. She's exactly my fight to bleed for, Benjamin said, and he meant it with a certainty that surprised even him, standing there with his arms spread, his own body the only thing between 4 leveled crossbows and the woman he loved. You want her, you go through me, and I'd think hard on what his lordship says when you bring back a dead gamekeeper instead of the quiet questioning he asked for. Benjamin, Ragesh said behind him, low and urgent, move. No, I do not need you to die for me. I'm not planning on dying, he said, not taking his eyes off Croft. "I'm planning on both of us walking out of these woods together, but I'm not moving from between you and those bolts, so you'd best hope I'm right." The standoff held for 3 long heartbeats, snow drifting silent between them, Croft's jaw working as he weighed the cost of killing the Lord's own gamekeeper against the cost of letting an orc walk free off the Lord's land. And it was in that breathless gap that Ragesh made her own choice, stepping up flush against Benjamin's back, her axe raised over his shoulder in plain view of every crossbow trained on them both, so that any bolt fired at him would have to pass through the warning of her blade first. And any bolt fired at her would have to go through him. "You will not take one more step toward either of us," she said, and her voice had dropped into something ancient and terrible, a warrior's voice that made even Croft's hardened men shift uneasily. "I have already buried one man I loved to your kind's wars. I did not come to these mountains to bury a second. Fire your bolts if you must, Forester, but know that the last thing you do on this earth will be watching me come through this man's blood to reach you, and I promise you it will not be quick." The threat hung heavy and absolute in the cold air, and Croft, for all his hard talk, was not a fool, and could see plainly that the men flanking him had gone pale and uncertain at the sheer conviction in her voice. "His lordship wants him brought in," Croft said again, weaker this time. "Then his lordship can ride out here himself and try," Benjamin said, "because I'm not leaving her, and she's not leaving me, and you've got exactly one more chance to lower those crossbows before this turns into something none of us walk away from clean." It was Croft who broke first, some flicker of self-preservation winning out over duty, and he lowered his own crossbow with a muttered curse, waving his men to do the same. "This isn't finished, Dalton. His lordship will hear of this." "Let him," Benjamin said. "Tell him his gamekeeper stood between a good woman and his forester's bolts and would do it again without blinking. Tell him whatever you like. We're going home." They backed away together through the snow, neither turning their back fully on the foresters until the trees had swallowed them from sight, and it was only once the camp was well behind them that Benjamin's legs finally gave out from under him, the shaking catching up all at once, and Ragesh caught him before he hit the snow, lowering them both down together against the trunk of an old pine, her arms wrapped fierce and tight around him. "You are a fool," she said into his hair, her voice rough with something between fury and love. "A brave, reckless fool standing in front of loaded crossbows for me." "Couldn't let them hurt you," he said, muffled against her shoulder. "Would rather take the bolt myself." "I would rather you take nothing," she said. "I would rather grow old with you whole and breathing, do you understand me? Do not do that again." "Can't promise that," he admitted. "Not where you're concerned." She was quiet a long moment, holding him in the snow, and when she finally spoke her voice had gone soft in a way he had not heard from her before, stripped of all its warrior's steel. "I did not think I would find anyone who would stand like that for me again. My husband did. I buried that kind of love once and swore I would not risk it a second time." She pulled back enough to look at him, her thumb brushing snow from his cheek. "Here you are, offering it to me anyway, without my even having to ask." "Didn't need asking," he said. "Just needed you." They walked back to Kestrel's Reach hand in hand through the deepening snow, and that night, with the fort's walls holding the winter storm at bay and the families settled around their fires, Ragesh Fireblood came to Benjamin Dalton's own small cottage instead of the loft above the granary, and neither of them pretended any longer that there was a question left between them worth asking. What passed between them that night was not hurried, not the hungry, desperate thing of that first kiss by the granary wall, but slow and deep and reverent. Two people who had each spent years convinced they would face the rest of their lives alone, finding in each other something neither had dared to hope still existed for them. And when dawn came gray and cold through the cottage's single shuttered window, she lay curled against him with her head on his chest and her fingers tracing idle patterns over his heart. And he thought that whatever came next, whatever Lord Ashcombe or Croft or the whole cold world beyond the fort's broken walls decided to throw at them, he would face every bit of it. Gladly, so long as she stayed beside him to face it. "Stay," he said into the quiet, not really a question. I already have, she said. I am not going anywhere, Benjamin Dalton, not now, perhaps not ever. The trouble Croft had promised arrived 11 days later, not with soldiers, but with a summons sealed in Lord Ashcombe's own wax, carried by a shivering rider who had forced his horse through drifts most men would have turned back from rather than face the Lord's displeasure at a late delivery. Benjamin Dalton was ordered to present himself at Ashcombe Keep within the week to answer charges of theft from the Lord's own stores and of harboring an unlawful orc upon Lord's land without license, and failure to appear would see the charges answered by force instead. "He means to make an example of you," Tam Fenwick said grimly, passing the letter back across the fire once Benjamin had read it aloud to the gathered families. "Or of her. Maybe both." "Then we go to him together," Ragesh said before Benjamin could speak, "and we answer for it together, and if he means to hang a gamekeeper for feeding starving children, he will find that hanging a gamekeeper's widow's axe alongside him is rather more trouble than he bargained for." "You're not my widow yet," Benjamin said, a weak attempt at levity that did not land the way he'd hoped, and she looked at him steady and unblinking. "No," she agreed, "not yet. But I intend to be something to you worth that word eventually, gamekeeper, if you will have me. And I do not intend to let a lord's greed take that future from either of us before it has properly begun." The widow Harlow, of all people, was the one who spoke up next, surprising the whole gathered fire. "You stood against Croft's men for us," she said to Ragesh, her voice still stiff with old prejudice but no longer cold, "and you've kept my boy fed and warm through the worst winter I've seen in 10 years. I'll not have you go alone into a lord's keep to answer for kindness. Half this fort will ride with you if it comes to that." It did not come to an armed ride in the end, though the offer alone settled something old and wary in Benjamin's chest, a proof that the fort had come to see Ragesh not as a stranger to be feared, but as one of their own to be defended. What they settled on instead, after a long night's argument around the fire, was that Benjamin and Ragesh would ride to Ashcombe Keep together, openly, and answer the charges honestly rather than hide from them. Because a man who had done nothing he was ashamed of, Benjamin reasoned, had no business slinking into a lord's hall like a criminal. Ashcombe Keep rose gray and forbidding at the end of 3 days' hard riding through snow that had finally begun to thin, its walls higher and better kept than anything at Kestrel's Reach had seen in decades, and Lord Ashcombe himself received them not in some grand hall, but in a cold outer courtyard, flanked by Croft and a dozen armed men, as if to make plain from the outset that this was a lord unwilling to grant even the courtesy of shelter to those he intended to judge. He was a narrow man, silver-haired, wrapped in furs far richer than anything the winter at the Reach had allowed, and he looked at Benjamin and then at Ragesh with the same flat appraising distaste, as though weighing the cost of 2 problems he would rather simply be rid of. "Benjamin Dalton," he said, "you stand accused of theft from stores that are by rights mine, and of harboring an unlicensed orc on land I own. Do you deny either charge?" "I don't deny feeding people who were starving on land you never once rode out to check on," Benjamin said, his voice steady despite the cold knot in his stomach. "I don't deny hiring the best hand I've ever had the good fortune to work beside, orc or otherwise. If those are crimes, my lord, then I'm guilty of both, and I do them again tomorrow." A ripple of unease went through the watching guards at such open defiance, but Lord Ashcombe only steepled his fingers, unbothered, the reaction of a man used to holding all the power in any room he entered. "Bold words," he said, "for a man whose life is currently mine to dispose of as I please." His gaze slid to Ragesh. "And you, the orc who thinks to threaten my foresters in my own woods?" "I threaten no one who did not first threaten mine," Ragesh said, unbowed, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Your foresters raised crossbows at an unarmed gamekeeper for the crime of feeding starving families. I would threaten worse than words for that again. You have quite a mouth on you, orc, for someone standing in a courtyard surrounded by my sworn men." "I have quite an axe as well, my lord," she said, though I have set it aside for this conversation as a courtesy you have not troubled to earn." For a moment Benjamin feared she had pushed too far, watching Ashcombe's face tighten with the particular fury of powerful men unused to being spoken to plainly. But then, unexpectedly, the Lord let out a short, humorless laugh. "You have spine," he said. "I will grant you that. More spine than most of the men I've hired to enforce my will out on that miserable frontier." He looked between them, at the way Benjamin had angled himself half in front of her without seeming to notice he'd done it, at the way she stood not behind him but beside him, equal footing, and something calculating passed behind the Lord's eyes. "Kestrel's Reach has been nothing but a drain on my ledgers for years, a ruin full of families I inherited the burden of rather than chose. I had half a mind to have you both hanged as a warning to the rest of that rabble to keep their thieving hands off my stores." "And the other half of your mind, my lord?" Benjamin asked, daring the question. Ashcombe studied them both a long moment, the courtyard silent but for the wind. "The other half of my mind notes that Kestrel's Reach has not once in 3 years failed to pay its due in furs and hides despite every hardship, that its people have not once risen against me despite every reason they might, and that the one thing keeping that wretched fort from collapsing entirely into the snow appears to be standing right in front of me, in the person of my own gamekeeper, and the orc woman he apparently intends to keep at his side, no matter what threat I level at either of you." He drummed his fingers against his belt. "I am not a sentimental man, Dalton. I have no interest in your love affairs, but I am a practical one, and it occurs to me that a hanged gamekeeper is a gamekeeper who can no longer keep my forest, and a burned-out fort full of dead settlers is considerably worse for my ledgers than a fort that quietly manages to feed itself without my involvement." "What are you proposing, my lord?" Ragesh asked, cutting straight to it in a way that made even Ashcombe's mouth twitch with grudging respect. "A bargain," he said. "I will drop the charge of theft, provided the Reach's furs and hides continue arriving on schedule, and I will grant formal license for the settlement at Kestrel's Reach to exist and be resupplied under my name, which will at least stop the merchants of Belhaven from bothering me with complaints about squatters on my land. I will further grant a license, since apparently it is required, for one orc widow to reside and work upon my land as the gamekeeper's own hired hand, and from the look of things, considerably more than that." His gaze flicked pointedly to where Benjamin's hand had found Ragesh's without either of them quite realizing it. "In exchange, Dalton, you will continue as my gamekeeper in truth, guarding my forest properly, and you will send me an honest accounting each season of what game is taken and by whom, so that I am not made a fool of twice. And you, orc, will keep that axe of yours pointed at wolves and raiders instead of my foresters, no matter how richly they may deserve it." Benjamin felt Ragesh's fingers tighten around his own, felt the held breath between them both, and understood in that moment that this narrow, greedy, unsentimental lord had just handed them, however grudgingly, however transactionally, the one thing they had not dared ask for outright, a future at Kestrel's Reach that no one could take from them by force of law ever again. "That's a fair bargain, my lord," Benjamin said, keeping his voice steady though his heart was hammering. "We accept it." "See that you honor it," Ashcombe said, already turning away, already bored of the whole affair now that the practical matter was settled. "Croft will draw up the papers, and Dalton—" He paused, glancing back over his shoulder with something almost like dry amusement. "Try not to get yourself killed standing between crossbows and orc women in future. I would rather not have to find a new gamekeeper. Competent ones are hard to come by out on that frontier." The papers were drawn and sealed within the hour, Ashcombe's own signature and wax pressed beside Benjamin's, granting formal license for the resettlement of Kestrel's Reach and for Ragesh Fireblood's place within it. And when they finally rode back out through the keep's gates into the thin winter sunlight, Benjamin let out a breath he felt he had been holding since the summons first arrived. "We did it," he said, half disbelieving. "We actually did it. You did it, Ragesh said, standing in front of a lord's own guards with your spine straight and your voice steady, same as you stood in front of Croft's crossbows. I have watched brave men in my life, Benjamin Dalton. I buried one of them. I have never seen bravery quite like yours, that stands not because it does not fear, but because it fears and stands anyway. I had good reason to stand, he said. Best reason I've ever had. They rode the 3 days back to Kestrel's Reach slower than they'd come, unhurried now that the weight of the summons no longer pressed at their backs, stopping each night to make camp beneath the clearing winter sky. And it was on the second night, with a small fire crackling against the cold and the papers securing their future folded safe in Benjamin's coat, that Ragesh finally spoke the words that had been building in her since the courtyard. There is a custom among my people, she said, watching the fire rather than him, uncharacteristically hesitant. When a warrior chooses a mate she intends to keep for the rest of her days. It is not the same as your human weddings with priests and papers. It is simpler and older, and it means more to my people than any paper a lord could sign. She reached into her belt and drew out a small curved blade, no longer than a finger, its edge honed bright even in the firelight. It is a mark, given by her own hand upon the one she chooses, so that any who see it know she has claimed him as fully hers, and any who would harm him know they harm a warrior's own heart in doing so. Benjamin's breath caught. You want to mark me? I want to claim you, she said, meeting his eyes now, steady and unguarded in a way he had rarely seen her, properly in the old way of my people if you will have it. I have already given you my loyalty and my axe, and though I have been slow to say the word aloud, my love, I would give you this too if you are not afraid of what it means. What does it mean? He asked, though he thought he already knew. That I have chosen you above all others for as long as I live, she said. That I will stand between you and any harm this world sends, the same as you have already stood for me. That there will be no undoing it, Benjamin Dalton, not by lords, not by war, not by anything short of death itself. It is not a thing given lightly, and I would not blame you for hesitating. He did not hesitate, not even a moment, holding out his forearm to her across the firelight with a steadiness that surprised even himself. Then mark me, he said. I chose you back in that road with 3 men's boots still fresh on my back, Ragesh. I've not changed my mind since, and I don't intend to. Her hands were gentle despite the blade, drawing a small, precise mark into the skin of his forearm, a shape like an axe crossed with a flame that he would later learn was her clan's own sigil, the pain sharp but brief, and when it was done she pressed her lips to the mark with a tenderness that undid him more thoroughly than any wound ever could. There, she said softly. Now the whole world may know it, same as I have known it since the road. You are mine, Benjamin Dalton, and I am yours, and no lord's paper and no widow's cold shoulder and no crossbow in the woods will ever change that again. Good, he said, drawing her into his arms there by the fire, the winter stars wheeling bright and cold above the two of them. Because I never wanted anything undone in the first place. They returned to Kestrel's Reach 3 days later to a welcome that startled them both. The fort's families gathered at the broken gate despite the cold, word having somehow outrun them of the bargain struck and the papers signed, and even the widow Harlow stood among them, her arms crossed but her face, for the first time since Ragesh's arrival, entirely without its old hard edge. You've saved this whole miserable fort, Tam Fenwick said, clapping Benjamin on the shoulder hard enough to stagger him, and brought us a warrior to keep it safe besides. I'd say that's a fair winter's work, gamekeeper. Wasn't just my work, Benjamin said, glancing at Ragesh beside him. Wouldn't have survived any of it without her. None of us would have, the widow Harlow said, and then stiffly, as though the words cost her something to say but she meant them regardless, thank you, for staying. For standing for these children, when you'd every reason to walk away from a fort that gave you nothing but cold looks when you arrived. Ragesh inclined her head, accepting the thanks with a grace that Benjamin found, not for the first time, quietly extraordinary in a woman who had every right to hold onto old grudges and chose instead to set them down. This is my home now, she said simply. I do not abandon my home. That spring, as the snow finally retreated from Kestrel's reach, and the first green showed through the frost-hard ground, Benjamin Dalton and Ragesh Fireblood stood together at the mended granary wall she had built with her own hands the autumn before, watching the fort's children chase each other across the thawing Commons yard, and he thought that he had never in his life expected to feel so thoroughly, so completely chosen. He had spent years believing himself a man the world had little use for beyond his labor, and here stood a warrior who could have gone anywhere, claimed any life she pleased, and had chosen instead to plant her axe in the frozen ground of a ruined fort at the edge of the map and call it home because he was in it. "What are you thinking?" Ragesh asked, catching him watching her the way he so often did. "That I still don't quite believe you're real," he admitted. "That some mornings I wake up half convinced I dreamed you up out of loneliness, and then I see the mark on my arm and I know I didn't." "You did not dream me," she said, stepping close, her hand finding his the way it always did now, easy and certain. "I am entirely, stubbornly real Benjamin Dalton, and I intend to remain so, standing right here beside you, for every winter and every spring you have left to live. You answered your own advertisement with a man's whole heart laid bare in a muddy road, though you did not know it yet, and I answered it with my axe and never once looked back. I do not intend to start looking back now." He kissed her there in the thin spring sunlight, with the mended wall at their backs and the fort's children laughing across the yard and the whole hard-won future they had bargained for stretching out ahead of them, and he thought that whatever else the world had denied him in his lonely years, it had finally, at long last, given him this: a home worth defending, and a fierce, magnificent, unshakable love who had chosen him, out of everyone she might have chosen, to stand beside for good.